And I believe I'm supposed to say a word of introduction. I don't know how much more I need to say, other than you all know and love Mr. Johnson. And he's not revealed to us, I think, what he's going to say. So either it is just going to come off the top of his mind, or we're just in for a surprise. So we're waiting for the revelation, the unveiling. So I'm looking forward to this. So, Mr. Johnson,
All right, all right, all
the
right.
floor is yours.
So I will share my screen. Those of you in my Latin class, often. Dr. Mccartney was kind enough to say something about Mr. Johnson's wisdom. It is not so. It is not so. It is never so. The only gift that I think that I have, that God has given me, is a curiosity to go rambling and find the wisdom of others. So that my intellect, such as it is like a crow that goes far afield looking for shiny bits. And occasionally those shiny bits are useful, but they're never mine. I just sort of steal them. So what we're going to talk about today is the mystical vision of G.K. Chesterton, which now sounds grand and huge. I mean, Chesterton was huge, both in his physical stature and also spiritually. The idea of mysticism is, I think, kind of scary to a lot of people, including myself. In fact, I'll start off by saying that I'm not entirely sure what it is. And so I'm hoping that today is perhaps us muddling a little bit towards some kind of demystification of mysticism and figuring out that it's not just something that people from hundreds of years ago were able to accomplish, but maybe something within our grasp as well. So in terms of the thing itself, what is mysticism? If you look and dig as I have been actually since October when I settled on this topic, I don't normally plan that far ahead. You'll find a number of definitions of mysticism, and not all of them helpful, really. There are different mystical traditions within different religions, which are actually still useful to look at, I think, because they're really about how to be open to something. But there are a few commonalities that I think that we can talk about that, again, maybe we get somewhere. So generally speaking, within the Catholic tradition, mysticism is very tightly tied to contemplation, and the contemplative life, where prayer, and especially meditative prayer, is an important part of one's own spiritual life, and also meditation, not that Eastern thing, but sort of Christian thoughtfulness. Meditation is not owned by the East. It is not, even though this is what you'll find when you're talking to most North Americans. But this piece of contemplation, what we imagine contemplation to be, I think sometimes is actually a bit of an obstacle to us actually attaining it. And so I'll come back to that idea. I think this is one of my theses, is that what we think mysticism is often an obstacle to actually achieving it. So let's just keep that thought in the back of our minds. What we achieve is bringing ourselves into a near presence of God, and that involves transformation. It involves a connection with the divine. And then in the end, we come from it transformed. Generally speaking, there are sort of two tests for whether an individual is a mystic, and one is that the vision, because there's usually some kind of a vision that unfolds from this connection with the divine. One is the transformation of self, and the other is that this vision also is transformative for other people who are given access to it. So, I mean, when we think of mystics, when we think of Catholic mystics, who we tend to think of is people like Saint Teresa of Avila or Saint John of the Cross, Or we might think, I think there's a mystical vision in St. Augustine. For those of you who are reading or have read the Confessions, there are moments where Augustine is articulating like a real experience with God, and he has to resort to poetry. You'll notice in those moments in order to try to tap into what that experience was. So when we talk about this thing of mysticism, then it tends to be of, I imagine the hermitess in her cell praying, or one of the Desert Fathers praying, or a removal from the world, or an ascetic praying. What I don't imagine most of the time, I think what most of us don't imagine when we're thinking about a mystic is in fact this fellow, 6'5", 350 pounds, who looked rather like a walrus, I think, and smoked cigars and drank beer, and at times was very poetic about beer, and enjoyed food very much, and then joked about his love of food and of cheese and bread and sweets and all of these good things, and who also liked to talk with children, or to defend fairy tales, or to laugh and giggle. And every time that I'm reading Chesterton, I always imagine Chesterton speaking in a low voice, but he had quite a high voice. And when he would laugh, it wasn't like a bellow, ha ha ha, it was a giggle. Chesterton was a giggler. So for such an immense man of so much influence, he's actually rather a silly individual. And so how can this man be a mystic? So in terms of my resources, I just want to say I'm going to be drawing from some of Chesterton's writings, particularly from his book, Orthodoxy, which is excellent reading. Also little bits from his biography of St. Thomas or St. Francis of Assisi. It's quite a short book, St. Francis of Assisi. And so you should read it, and read it slowly, because it's dense, it's rich. And I think it takes a little bit of going through, but I'll be reading a few excerpts from that as well. And then also drawing from this book from Father Robert Wilde, here, called The Tumbler of God. He suggests that Chesterton is a mystic. And then last is this book here. It's called The Noonday Devil. Maybe I'll put these in the chat later, because there'll probably be time at some point. The Noonday Devil, about acedia. Acedia is kind of an old word, a very old word, for the deadly sin that we know as sloth. And so this writer, Father Jean-Charles No, is suggesting actually sloth isn't what we think it is. Sloth is not laziness. I mean, laziness can come in under the umbrella of sloth, but sloth can also be a busyness, a kind of a hectic busyness that fills up your day with nothing. It's like static activity. And it's the sort of thing that distracts instead of being focused. That when we're distracted on the little things that we're doing, and we putter around with our lives, and it's just all busyness and hecticness, and oh me, oh my, I'm so busy, but we're not actually still. And at that point, our busyness actually pushes out God. Then our lives become so cluttered that we make no room for God. And God is a polite guest. God does not come in unless invited. And so that is one of the ideas of the mystic, I think, is that God within us has built a door, but he gives us the guardianship of that door in our hearts and in our souls. And he gives us the key and says, here, ask me in any time. But that's all we have to do. That in a way that our only action, our only agency in our own salvation is to open that door. And it is all that we can do. And it's more than some of us can do with all of our strength, is to open that door. So in a sense, maybe that's not another bad way of thinking about what mysticism is. It's a particular kind of way of opening the door and letting in the fresh air, which is the breath of the Holy Spirit. So with some of these ideas, then let's maybe move forward and talk about how can it be that this great big giggler, G.K. Chesterton, could possibly be a mystic. And I think we have to go back actually into the days before he had converted to Christianity. He starts off as a fairly committed atheist of the sophisticated British sort, who enjoyed high culture, who enjoyed high art, who enjoyed talking about things, talking about the high literature and the high art over tea. But he was at the same time suffering depression, a deep depression. And he says then at some point, he alludes to it, although he also makes jokes about it. There's a poem I did not include where he sort of makes jokes about him thinking about a noose. But then he talks about all the reasons that he doesn't hang himself today. But there are butterflies and there are bees, so I will not hang myself today. And then he'll write another verse where he talks about, but there is sunset and there's the smell of coffee and there are people on the street. So I will not hang myself today because there's something rather than nothing. This is the moment that Father Robert Wilde believes that within this darkness, within the cave that Chesterton was living and that depression in which he was stuck, that Chesterton was touched by God. And in Chesterton's own writings, in his own biography, he talks about how he came away from this vision with a profound feeling of a very simple thing, that it was amazing and wonderful that there was life instead of nothing, that there was anything at all instead of nothing. So he says, he writes, I hung on to religion by one thin thread of thanks. I thanked whatever gods might be, because he had not yet converted to Christianity. I thanked whatever gods might be, because no life lived forever, but because also that there was any life at all. So that's an idea worth sinking into a little bit, that Chesterton was relieved that there was a universe at all. He thought that that was wondrous and that we should all be sort of gobsmacked by the fact that there is something at all. Let's kind of look at this a little bit more here. He says, looking back at himself in the past, he says, I had tried to be happy by telling myself that man is an animal like any other, which sought its meat from God. But now I really was happy, for I had learned that man is a monstrosity. I had been right in feeling all things as odd, for I myself was at once worse and better than all things. The optimist's pleasure was prosaic, he means flat, for it dwelt on the naturalness of everything. The Christian pleasure was poetic, for it dwelt on the unnaturalness of everything in the light of the supernatural. The modern philosopher had told me again and again that I was in the right place, and I had still felt depressed, even in acquiescence, even in agreement. But I had heard that I was in the wrong place, and my soul sang for joy like a bird in spring. The knowledge found out and illuminated forgotten chambers in the dark house of infancy. I knew now why grass had always seemed to me as queer as the green beard of a giant, and why I could feel homesick at home. And this is a very typical kind of thing for Chesterton, to actually contemplate on grass. And this is the piece where I think he was a contemplative, because of how he reacted to everyday things. And so many contemplatives will sort of turn inward. Chesterton kind of turns outward and finds God in his creation. So this idea then of Chesterton's that there's something rather than nothing, this is the anchor that he comes back to again and again and again. And it explains why it is that he will write an essay on cheese, or why he will write an essay on dogs, or write an essay on a piece of chalk, and pull beautiful wisdom out of it, because he thought that even something as simple as a blade of grass or a flower was actually wondrous. You could spend a lot of time just staring at it. It was a matter of perspective. Okay, so that idea of perspective, I think, in Chesterton If we just kind of follow along here, there's this idea he thinks we should flip our perspectives upside down. Okay, we should flip our perspectives about the world upside down, about what is solid and what is not. So this next bit is from his biography of St. Francis of Assisi. Chesterton wrote, "If a man saw the world upside down, with all the trees and towers hanging head downward as in a pool, one effect would be to emphasize the idea of dependence. There is a Latin and literal connection, for the very word dependence only means hanging. It would make vivid the scriptural text which says that God has hanged the world upon nothing. If St. Francis saw in one of his strange dreams the town of Assisi upside down, it need not have differed in a single detail from itself, except in being entirely the other way around. But the point is this, that whereas to the normal eye, on a normal day, the large masonry of its walls or the massive foundations of its watchtowers and its high citadel would make it seem safer and more permanent, the moment it was turned over, the very same weight would make it seem more helpless and more in peril. It is but a symbol, but it happens to fit the psychological fact. St. Francis might love his little town as much as before, or more than before, but the nature of the love would be altered, even in being increased. He might see and love every tile on the steep roofs, or every bird on the battlements, but he would see them all in a new and divine light of eternal danger and dependence, instead of being merely proud of his strong city because it could not be moved. He would be thankful to God Almighty that it had not been dropped from the sky. He would be thankful to God for not dropping the whole cosmos like a vast crystal to be shattered into falling stars. Perhaps St. Peter saw the world so when he was crucified head downward. So this idea of Chesterton's should make us think about the universe a little bit differently, and perhaps make us think about the first moments of creation differently. I think it is pretty common among Christians, among Catholics, to think of creation as something that happened a long, long time ago, and then there will be some disagreement about how long ago, but long ago. Chesterton would suggest that that act of creation is actually ongoing, that it never actually stopped, that if the universe is like a balloon, then the breath of God is still blowing into it, and because it is still expanding. After all, the image fits. You know, the idea that in the center of the universe, not the physical center, but its causal center, maybe, right? It's sort of a spiritual center. The fires of creation are still burning. And that Chesterton's idea is that this reality that we're in is like a balloon that is sustained by the will of God. And that if God were to withhold it, it would collapse back into nothingness again. And so that idea that if we actually flip everything upside down and we imagine a city hanging from the heavens, and the only thing that keeps the whole thing from falling down is the will of God, what it provokes is gratitude. And this is a very typical kind of thing of Chesterton's spirituality, is that he is forever infused with gratitude. He talks about gratitude all the time. He talks about gratitude as the highest form of prayer. He talks about gratitude as being, what does he say? He says it's thanks doubled by wonder, as an appropriate stance towards the Creator. He also writes, I'll just finish this little bit, okay, again in St. Francis of Assisi. He writes, "It is commonly, in a somewhat cynical sense, that men have said, 'Blessed is he that expects nothing, for he shall not be disappointed.' It was in a wholly happy and enthusiastic sense that St. Francis said, 'Blessed is he who expects nothing, for he shall enjoy everything.' It was by this deliberate idea of starting from zero, from the dark nothingness of his own deserts, that he did come to enjoy even earthly things, as few people have enjoyed them. And they are in themselves the best working example of the idea. For there is no way in which a man can earn a star or deserve a sunset. But there is more than this involved, and more indeed than is easily expressed in words. It is not only true that the less a man thinks of himself, the more he thinks of his good luck and of all the gifts of God. It is also true that he sees more of the things themselves when he sees more of their origin, for their origin is a part of them, and indeed the most important part of all." So This, I think, is one of the keys to Chesterton's sort of sacramental mind, that he sees God even amongst the flowers, amongst the children. You know, just to kind of get into this idea that how we're thinking and how we're seeing is the difference between sort of a small s sacramental moment and just going about our busy lives, and the very the dangerousness, the numbness that comes with going about our daily lives, right? Here's this little snippet from a poem from Elizabeth Barrett Browning that I rather like, because it gets the same point. She writes, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. And only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries." And so I think this is a little bit of what this noonday devil, acedia, is about. That this is the danger of sloth, is of just kind of going about your life and getting on the bus and not being aware that the whole thing is amazing. We all ought to be shocked and amazed, shocked and amazed. So I would like to tell a little bit of a parable, and it is one that I think a few of my students I've shared this one with before, or at least summed it up. And it is from his work, Tremendous Trifles. So I'm just going to read this and kind of comment as I go. It's a fairy tale, of course, because it's Chesterton. Once upon a time, there were two little boys who lived chiefly in the front garden because their villa was a model one. The front garden was about the same size as a dinner table. It consisted of 4 strips of gravel, a square of turf with some mysterious pieces of cork standing up in the middle, and 1 flower bed with a row of red daisies. One morning, while they were playing in these romantic grounds, a passing individual, probably the milkman, leaned over the railing and engaged them in philosophical conversation. The boys, whom we will call Paul and Peter, were at least sharply interested in his remarks, for the milkman, who was, I need say, a fairy, did his duty in that state of life by offering them in the regulation manner anything that they chose to ask for. And Paul closed with the offer with a businesslike abruptness, explaining that he had long wished to be a giant, that he might stride across continents and oceans and visit Niagara or the Himalayas in an afternoon dinner stroll. The milkman produced a wand from his breast pocket, waved it in a hurried and perfunctory manner, and in an instant, the model villa with its front garden was like a tiny doll's house at Paul's colossal feet. He went striding away with his head above the clouds to visit Niagara and the Himalayas. But when he came to the Himalayas, he found they were quite small and silly looking, like the little cork rockery in the garden. And when he found Niagara, it was no bigger than the tap turned on in the bathroom. He wandered around the world for several minutes, trying to find something really large and finding everything small, till in sheer boredom, he lay down on 4 or 5 prairies and fell asleep. Unfortunately, his head was just outside the hut of an intellectual backwoodsman, who came out of it at that moment with an axe in one hand and a book of neo-Catholic philosophy in the other. The man looked at the book, and then at the giant, and then at the book again. And in the book it said, "It can be maintained that the evil of pride consists in being out of proportion to the universe." So the backwoodsman put down his book, took his axe, and working 8 hours a day for about a week, cut the giant's head off, and there was an end of him. Such is the severe yet healthy history of Paul. But Peter, oddly enough, made exactly the opposite request. He said he had long wished to be a pygmy, about half an inch high, and of course he immediately became one. When the transformation was over, he found himself in the midst of an immense plain, covered with a tall green jungle, and above which at intervals rose strange trees, each with a head like the sun in symbolic pictures, with gigantic rays of silver and a huge heart of gold. Toward the middle of this prairie stood up a mountain of such romantic and impossible shape, yet of such stony height and dominance that it looked like some incident of the end of the world. And far away on a faint horizon, he could see the line of another forest, taller and yet more mystical, of a terrible crimson color, like a forest on fire forever. And he set out on his adventures across that colored plain, and he has not come to the end of it yet. Such is the story of Peter and Paul, which contains all the highest qualities of a modern fairy tale, including that of being wholly unfit for children. And indeed, the motive with which I have introduced it is not childish, but rather full of subtlety and reaction. It is, in fact, the almost desperate motive of excusing the pages that follow. Peter and Paul are the two primary influences upon European literature today, and I may be permitted to put my own preference in its most favorable shape, even if I can only do it by what little children call telling a story. So in this, then, Chesterton is making a very important point that to be worldly and to be jaded, to be sophisticated, to bounce around the world is to risk it seeming small. And it is much better to see the world as very, very big. And that even small things, when seen from a small perspective, become big things. And I'm actually going to skip a little bit and jump to the end of that particular story from Tremendous Trifles, where he talks about the opposite, the importance of kind of lowering ourselves as opposed to exalting ourselves as a spiritual stance. Because the opposite of becoming small is becoming big. So he writes, I have my doubts about the real value in mountaineering, in getting to the top of everything and overlooking everything. Satan was the most celebrated of Alpine guides when he took Jesus to the top of an exceeding high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the earth. But the joy of Satan in standing on a peak is not a joy in largeness, but a joy in beholding smallness. In fact, that all men look like insects at his feet. It is from the valley that things look large. It is from the level that things look high. I am a child of the level and have no need of that celebrated Alpine climber. I will lift up my eyes to the hills from whence cometh my help. But I will not lift up my carcass to the hills unless it is absolutely necessary. Everything is in an attitude of mind, and at this moment I am in a comfortable attitude. I will sit still and let the marvels and the adventures settle on me like flies. There are plenty of them, I assure you. The world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder. And so in this, then, I think is the key to another piece with Chesterton, that he is a giggler and a teller of stories. He is a great laugher, but he also speaks of humility as one of the most important things that one can have within ourselves. That it's not a mistake that humor and humility actually share a root word. That they both come from humus, the ground. I'm just I wanted to show this because ants from up close are actually quite fascinating, you know, and that looking down on people from a height is sort of, you know, metaphorically something that gives us a sense of power and strength, but all of that comes from fear. And so humility is how we combat it. And humility is also how we stop thinking not lower of ourselves and not less of ourselves, but maybe less about ourselves. And then the more we look out at things, and as Mrs. Dumore was talking about, like the sound of water, sometimes there are cliches that are so old that we actually lose the wisdom in them. When to hear the cliche, you have to stop and smell the roses. That means we're too busy sometimes to notice the gratitude that we ought to have for a rose, or for a dandelion, or for a dog. And so that is the sort of mindfulness, that is a Christian mindfulness, where we should all be just blown away all the time by how wonderful all of it is, including my hands. Look at this, ladies. Chesterton would say that a baby is actually sensible. A baby is more sensible to the gift and the miracle of its own body when it's just staring at its own hand. Good heavens, thank Christ, maybe this baby is thinking, and then it puts its hand into its mouth, you know, and this sort of thing. So in terms of the how, you know, I think this is also kind of what Mrs. Dumore is saying. It's sort of a habit. This is also what Aristotle would say. So Mrs. Dumore and Aristotle are in agreement that the habit of mind, that you have to build a habit of not being so busy, or even in your busy moments, trying not to be distracted. It's not something you can just simply do out of sheer will, but it needs to be a habit. And I think, like any other habit, that it needs to be also attended with prayer. You know, dear Holy Spirit, be with me, and let me be mindful of the gifts around me all the time. So that's it. Sorry about the technical difficulties there, ladies and gentlemen. We're so close.